Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We are under 50 days from the Iowa caucus, where Republican primary voters will have their first shot to choose a presidential nominee. And the last time that most of the country went to the polls, we had a big sort of national election, the 2022 midterm elections, a little over a year ago. And as you might remember, Republicans delivered a pretty shocking underperformance in those elections. And it was an underperformance that was particularly pronounced among the Trump-aligned candidates. We saw this early in that election night, and it just kept going. The Kari Lake in Arizona, and the Herschel Walkers in Georgia, and the TV Dr. Mehmet Oz's in Pennsylvania. In short, MAGA lost big in 2022. And as a result, at the time, there was a real feeling that people understood that Donald Trump's political potency had waned, that he was an albatross, and ergo it would be a good idea to get someone new as a Republican standard bearer in this election contest. And we might be in for a competitive Republican presidential primary in 2023 into 24. And that is why you saw so many candidates decide to run against Donald Trump earlier this year. Of course, now, with the benefit of hindsight, things have not really turned out that way. The base still loves Trump, wants him to be the party's nominee. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is, of course, widely seen as the most viable alternative to Trump, has delivered one of the worst campaign performances of all time. Truly one of the most stunning cash-burning operations in recent American politics. At the start of this year, DeSantis was at least feasibly competitive with Trump in the polls. Look at that. That's a real race. By the time he announced in late May, much later than many observers thought he should, Trump had opened up about a 30-point lead in the polling averages. And then in that time, the DeSantis campaign and affiliated PACs has spent nearly $50 million on advertising, only to see his numbers sink even lower to near single digits, while Trump's lead widened to about 45 points. You're going in the wrong direction, Ron. I think it's fair to say that this is not where Florida Governor Ron DeSantis wanted to end up. I think it has dawned on the non-Trump-loving parts of the Republican Party, and there are those elements, we're going to talk about that in a sec, that there is one last chance, 50 days out from Iowa, one last chance for a competitive primary, barring some huge unforeseen circumstances, okay? Given the table as it is set right now, one last chance to have it out over the future of what the party, the Republican Party, and whether it is going to fully align itself behind the man who wants to end American democracy, or whether the Republican Party is going to continue to be a party that's woven into the fabric of the constitutional republic. That's the choice for the party. And the way to make that happen would be a one-on-one contest between Trump and former South Carolina governor and UN ambassador Nikki Haley. Anything other than complete consolidation of the non-Trump forces in the race are only going to help Trump by splitting the vote. I suspect that is at least partly why we've seen former Vice President Mike Pence and South Carolina Senator Tim Scott suspend their campaigns fairly abruptly, actually. Maybe other Republicans in the race, not named Nikki Haley, will take their lead. Now, it's clearly not a majority view of primary voting Republicans. But there is definitely a contingent of the Republican Party that would like to, if they could, they'd like to move on from Trump. And these folks are just not particularly well represented anymore. I mean, the conservative media is basically fully in the tank for MAGA. Most of the so-called never-Trump Republicans have essentially become parts of the Democratic Party coalition, especially in the Biden era. So there really is like no one out there in the world who speaks for this group of people. But they really do exist. I mean, there really are literally millions of them. They show up in polling. I mean, around 20% of the Republican Party disapproves of Donald Trump. And for these people who don't like the Democrats, they're not Democrats, they're conservatives, but who also don't like Trump, Nikki Haley appears to be their best shot. In fact, we've seen a succession of headlines in just the last few days that demonstrate that dawning realization. Haley's affiliated super PAC spent almost $9 million on advertising this month. That's a lot. It's nearly as much as both Trump and DeSantis' PACs combined. You've got Jamie Dimon, the billionaire CEO of JP Morgan Chase, who's been talking up Haley to anyone who will listen, including during an event earlier today.
I did come out and make a nice statement about Nikki Haley.
You did. You've been talking to Nikki Haley.
Very liberal, yes, I have. Even if you're a very liberal Democrat, I urge you, help Nikki Haley too. Get a choice on a Republican side that might be better than Trump.
Also this week, it was reported that Americans for Prosperity, the infamous political arm of the Koch network, would be backing Haley as well, which is a huge development, providing her access to a near endless stream of dark money. Now, the Koch political network, run by Charles Koch, one of the richest men on earth, has had, obviously, a relentlessly and profoundly malignant influence on American life. In many ways, its unlimited supply of near untraceable money backing political movements like the Tea Party and then candidates paved the way for Donald Trump, brought us to the moment that we're in. And also, just to be absolutely clear, I really don't like at all Nikki Haley's politics. I think it would be a bad thing for the country if she were elected president. She would pursue an agenda that negatively impacts the material conditions for working Americans in nearly every way, from the climate to tax cuts to abortion rights. But, and also, I don't think Nikki Haley would prove to be an existential threat to the very framework of our representative democracy like Donald Trump clearly would be and is. Listen to her at the first primary debate, dressing down candidate Vivek Ramaswamy over Ukraine.
Ukraine is the front line of defense. Putin has said once Russia takes Ukraine, Poland and the Baltics are next. That's a world war. We're trying to prevent war. Look at what Putin did today. He killed Prigozhin. When I was at the UN, the Russian ambassador suddenly died. This guy is a murderer, and you are choosing a murderer over a pro-American country.
Now, that doesn't sound absolutely crazy. It's sort of, I don't know, like normal American foreign policy view, with some that even Democrats have, right? And politics, at least in my view, particularly these days, is often about the lesser of two evils. It's about harm reduction. Sometimes even it's about choosing the bad over the cataclysmic. And from that perspective, it's just undoubtedly a good thing the Koch network is making this realization about Haley as the last viable option and this investment. It's a positive thing that Wall Street executives are telling people they should back Haley for the good of the country. It is to the benefit of American democracy for there to be a strong faction of the Republican Party, one of the two major ones we have, committed to defeating Donald Trump. And to be clear, they have a strong case to make. I mean, it's been fairly well shown now that Haley would be a strong general election candidate. The polling reliably shows this. In fact, in lots of polls, she's the one candidate polling above Trump in head-to-heads. She's got executive experience. She's got foreign policy experience. More cynically, the polls show she's a formidable nominee. Recent poll from Marquette Law School shows Haley beating Joe Biden by double digits, far ahead of Trump and Ron DeSantis. And of course, there's also the element of poetic justice at play for the Republicans. I mean, here's the reality. Nominating anyone other than Donald Trump would almost certainly rip the party asunder. It might even break it in its current name and form. I mean, Trump would then set himself to the goal of the total destruction of the Republican Party, just like he did against America as a whole, should they nominate anyone other than him. The fact of the matter is, that's probably what the Republican Party deserves. I mean, again, if I'm writing the script here, I mean, to be destroyed by the monster they created and enabled for the better part of a decade, Nikki Haley included, as you know from the open. And they all know that threat hangs over them. So anyone who takes up the effort to defeat Trump, to really go after him, to try to beat him in this Republican primary anyway, deserves support.